didn't go to art school and you're a self-taught photographer, it can be difficult to know who you should study if you want to get better. Obviously, there are amazing photographers who've gone before us and they have a lot to teach us. In this video, it's my intention to give you an overview of 5 portrait photographers that I think you should consider studying in order to improve your own photography. I'll give you an overview of who they are, what they did, and what I think you can learn from them. And down in the description below, I'll give you several links that you can go and learn more about them. And at the end of this video, I'll tell you how, as a self-taught photographer, I find inspiration and photographers to go and learn more about. So the first photographer that I want to tell you about is Mr. Yousuf Karsh. Karsh was an Armenian immigrant to Canada, moved there in 1925 when he was 17, and he worked throughout North America and the world until I think around 1992 when he closed his studios, and sadly he passed in 2002. Lots of people will tell you to study Yousuf Karsh, and if you do a YouTube search, you'll find quite a lot of videos about him. And most of those videos are focused on his lighting techniques, which are absolutely perfect most of the time. There are online resources. There is the Karsh Estate. Karsh was quite shrewd in that he donated all of his work to the Canadian Archives when he closed his studios, and online there is the Karsh Estate, which has a website, karsh.org, which you can view a lot of his work, and he even detailed his lighting techniques for you and how he mixes developer fluids, what he used, etc., and how he did it. But Karsh is a hugely successful photographer. He was probably the most famous celebrity photographer of the 20th century. He photographed basically everybody who was anybody, from celebrities to world leaders. If you've heard of Karsh before, you have probably heard the story of how he got Winston Churchill's portrait, the one that if you're British you will know because it's on the £5 note, and it's probably the most famous portrait of Winston Churchill. There's a story which gets mistold all the time, but if you search on YouTube, there is a video from the TV show Wogan from the 80s in the UK where Karsh himself tells the story. Essentially, to boil the story down, Karsh deliberately upsets Churchill in order to get the image he wants. One of the crucial things that only comes out in the Wogan interview, and I've not heard any of the stories, is that Karsh then got to take other photographs of Churchill at different times, photographs that his family prefer over the famous one. Because Karsh's real skill, in my opinion, not his real skill, that's unfair. He's an extremely skilled photographer. But the thing that sets him apart from other extremely skilled photographers was his people power. His ability to draw from people, and the Churchill story, which you definitely should go and listen to, is a classic example. Draw from people, particularly people who he had a knowledge of, who he'd researched, celebrities, etc. Draw from them the emotional reaction that he required to make a portrait that he felt represented who they were or represented their soul. And he very much is honest about the fact that there are two sides to all sorts of people. So he knows that he did this very stern looking portrait of Churchill, who of course was famous for his leadership of the UK during the Second World War and his bulldog spirit and all of that sort of stuff. But equally, he took portraits of Churchill smiling and happy, which his family treasured, probably the side of him that they knew. So yeah, definitely study Karsh. The Karsh Estate has an Instagram page, has a Facebook page. They've put a huge amount of resources online. You don't need to go out and buy his books. They're not in print anymore, but you can get them secondhand bookshops. If you can get one, get it. But listen to as much as you can about the stories about how he took the photographs and how he dealt with people. That's where Karsh really shines for me, how he dealt with people and how he made them want to have their photo taken from him. There's a story about Field Marshal Montgomery, another British soldier, very famous from the Second World War, travelling to Canada and specifically requesting that the Canadian government arrange for him to have his portrait taken by Karsh as part of his tour and his visit. And it appears that lots of world dignitaries, when they went to Canada, specifically requested could they have a portrait taken by Karsh. That sort of thing doesn't happen just because of technical ability. That happens because people enjoy the process. That happens because they know that the photo has an emotional resonance, draws something out rather than just their physical appearance, and that only comes from people's skills. So yeah, study Yousuf Karsh if you want to take photographs of people. So the next portrait photographer I think you can learn something from is a German called August Sander. Now August Sander, some would say, is a documentarian rather than a portrait photographer, but I would say that he's both. Sander lived in Germany from, I think he was born in about 1870s time-ish, and he died in the 1960s. What you can learn from Sander is the importance of the project and the mission, and taking the time. He has produced one of the most comprehensive socio-economic portrait catalogues that anybody will ever produce. He worked his way through Germany and the surrounding area and some other countries, taking portraits of everyday people, young, old, working age, identifying them only by their occupation and location, treating them all with absolute dignity, documenting them in detail, and creating a representation of them as a person, but also as a representation of their occupation, their region, their class, etc. And Sander it's difficult to estimate how determined he was. He built up a huge volume of work by the time the Second World War had broke out, and the Gestapo burnt and destroyed loads of it. So for many of us, after having done decade plus of work, and this wasn't just walking around with a little camera taking shots, he carried around a large format camera with glass plates. What does he do after that? Well, many people of course would just give up. No, he moved to the country so that he could continue to take more photographs and try and protect his archive from bombing, and he continued to work. There's a huge volume of work that was issued after his death, all his work in one volume, which is very hard to get, very expensive when you can get it, but there's a massive volume of work online about August Sander. You should absolutely check it out. If ever you thought about starting a project and seeing it through, August Sander is there to show you why it's worth it. His volume of work is immense, and you should absolutely check it out. August Sander often goes unmentioned. There's not a huge amount on YouTube about him, but his work is immense, and it is online. There's a lot of it online if you take the time to look. But if you can get one of his books, then get the book, undoubtedly. The next photographer on the list that I think you could do well to study is a lady called Eve Arnold, she's most famous for being the first woman accepted into Magnum Photos. Now, if you Google Eve Arnold, you will probably find her described as a photojournalist, because in the latter half of her career, she documented births and a lot of social things going on, and that's very much part of her work. But at her core, Eve Arnold is a portrait photographer. She's probably most famous for her photos of portrait work. Is probably most famous for her photos of Marilyn Monroe and Marlene Dietrich. And what you can learn from Eve Arnold is there is a certain tenderness to her photos. I know, great technical term and really easy to learn from, but if you read about the behind the scenes of how Arnold achieved her photography, particularly with likes of Marilyn Monroe, she spent a great deal of time with people. She really got to know them, really got under their skin. She indulged them. She took a lot of studio portraits of Monroe that she didn't really particularly care about herself, so that she could eventually earn her trust and get part of her daily life and get in there and reveal the person below, the more fragile human below the exterior. And I would suggest that you would do well, and we all would do well, to practice her techniques of getting to know people really well, with the people we already know really well, so that we can reveal who they are, family and friends. I think as you take your portrait photography more seriously, you are less likely to pull your camera out at any given moment in your day-to-day life. When, on the other hand, you have somebody like Eve Arnold, who her entire approach to photography seems to have been to uncover the person by always having a camera in their hand and being part of their life, spending as much time with them as possible, and not just about photography. And when I look back at my own photographic archive in Lightroom, when I first got started, I have some photos that I maybe dismissed at the time that I now realise are some of my most valuable photos of my family, because they are taken in moments that don't really matter. They show the real expressions, the real feelings, and I know as I age and as people pass, and those photos will become more and more valuable to me. And I know this is a very big tangent to jump from Eve Arnold as a celebrity portrait photographer to you and your family and your friends, but really that's what Eve Arnold can teach you, how to capture those moments, those split seconds, those expressions, those things that we don't normally value, I think, when we're taking a portrait. It's the complete opposite of picking up a camera and saying to somebody, please smile. So anyway, Eve Arnold, definitely somebody you should investigate. Gregory Heisler. Heisler is a portrait photographer from the US, been operating since the mid to late 20th century, 60s, 70s, 80s, when his work starts to appear. Heisler is outstanding, and he's written one of the best photography behind the scenes books that money can buy, and it is still in print, which is called 50 Portraits. And if you can afford it, then you definitely should get it. If you can't afford it, there is a huge amount of information that Heisler puts online. He has a website with lots of his images on it. He has YouTube videos of lectures he's giving. There's a hell of a lot you can learn from Heisler. Heisler is the master of adaptation and innovation in creating a portrait that represents the person, whether it be as simple as being sent out by a magazine or publication to take a photograph of somebody in their home, to building a Hollywood set almost in order to achieve the look he wants. He goes from one extreme to the other, and he always seems to manage to capture something that is absolutely representative of the person. In his book 50 Portraits, the first story that he tells you about is his portrait of boxing coach Louis Sara. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Basically, Mr. Sara was a famous boxing coach who was in his older years, and he was famous for his very big hands. Heisler was sent to take his photograph for a magazine, I forget which one, at his home. The subject, Mr. Sara, was very reluctant to have his photo taken because he had a mark on his lip, some sort of cold sore or something like that. Knowing the importance of his hands and how famous his hands were, Heisler managed to construct a photograph which emphasized his hands, the size of them in relation to the size of his head, and helped to save his embarrassment and cover the mark on his face. This was all done with very little gear on the front porch of the subject's house. Then we go to a story about how he took a photograph of Ed Harris in what appears to be the desert, and basically a movie set's built for it. If you want to learn about innovation, then look at Heisler. Definitely look at his work. His lighting is great, but that's something you'll always find with the greats. They perfect their lighting, they perfect their technique, they know how to use their gear, and there is something more. Finding that something more is what will help you to improve your photography and become a great photographer in the end. Getting the right lighting, getting all of the technical things correct, that is the minimum requirement. It's not the aim. With Heisler, innovation, ability to adapt, ability to think, ability to use the environment. That's what I learned from Heisler, and I think you can too. Herb Ritts was a fashion, portrait, fine art photographer from Los Angeles, prolific in the 1980s. He even went on to shoot music videos. Now, Herb Ritts' work is prolific. It's very celebrity heavy and very fashion heavy. But one of the things that you'll notice about Ritts, and I think you can learn from him, is that he was able to create his own style, and not instantly. It evolved over time. Ritts' style for me is use of natural light, and not just the golden hour, not just the blue hour, harsh daylight sun as well. He was a master of locations and creativity. Learning from him as a person, Ritts' photographic career was actually relatively short, 24, 25 years or so. But during that time, he seems to have been able to cultivate ongoing relationships with people so that he was able to photograph them over a period of time. The most classic example of this being Madonna. But something else that we learned from Ritts as well is his early breaks came from having a camera on him. His first big break was getting published some photos of Richard Gere that he took before Richard Gere was famous. They happened to know each other through Richard Gere's girlfriend, and he just had his camera on him when they broke down and had to pull into a garage, and he took some photos of Gere using the environment of the garage, working the scene, using the sky to create a pure white backdrop, getting some images that are today regarded as quite iconic. And you see this trend being refined throughout his work as time goes on. He uses his environment, he uses it very well. I don't know whether he chased the light, because he used natural light an awful lot, but he seems to have been able to shoot in anything at any time, anywhere, sliding seamlessly from high fashion to intimate portraiture to fine art. There's a lot of information online about Ritts, and there is a lot of work out there. There are books you can buy, there are YouTube videos you can watch, there are websites you can read, and I would strongly recommend you to do so. So at the beginning of this video, I told you that I would tell you how I, as a self-taught photographer, go about finding inspiration and new photographers from the past to look up and study and see what I can learn from them. Now, the key thing I would tell you is don't just look at their work, try and learn about them, about their techniques, about how they dealt with people, what makes them special. Being a photographer who is able to produce perfect light, who is able to produce perfect composition, is not enough to make you a great photographer. If you study the great photographers, you will find those things are a minimum. The thing that makes them great is there's something else they bring to the table, something about them usually, more than about their photography. That comes through in their photography. Now, if you're looking for more photographers to study, to follow, then my recommendation is that you buy or get from the library compendium books that pull together lots of photographers. Books like this one, which I've reviewed on the channel, I'll put a link to that video at the end, which give you a collection of photos, single photo by a photographer, tells you a little bit about them, and if that's enough to pique your interest, then off you go and study that photographer later. Anyway, till next time, keep on learning.